We did not come to cure your monster, old man. We came to incinerate him. Sign this." The coffee in my ceramic mug was exactly 140 degrees, a precise temperature I had perfected over decades of solitary mornings. Just hot enough to sting the tongue, but cool enough to swallow without a wince. I sat on the weathered pine porch of my cabin in the Cabinet Mountains of Montana, watching the sunrise bleed a bruised purple and violent orange over the snow-capped peaks to the east. It was a Tuesday, or perhaps it was a Wednesday, for when you live as far out as I do, 20 miles of treacherous dirt track from the nearest paved road and deeper still from the town of Libby, the days tend to blur into a singular, peaceful rhythm of survival and silence. The air smelled of sharp pine needles, damp earth, and the bacon grease I had just scraped off the cast-iron skillet and into the compost bin near the garden. My dog, a ragged and gray-muzzled blue heeler named Buster, was asleep at my feet, his paws twitching in a dream of chasing the rabbits he was no longer fast enough to catch. It was a kind of silence you cannot buy with money. The kind that settles deep in your calcium-deficient bones and tells you that the world is right, that the chaos of civilization is a distant memory, and that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. I took a sip of the coffee, closing my eyes to listen to the wind moving through the Douglas firs like the breath of a sleeping giant. And for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that this peace would last forever. Then, the silence shattered. It was not a sound at first, but a vibration, a deep, resonant thud that shook the floorboards beneath my boots and rattled the spoon against the side of my mug. Buster bolted upright, his hackles raised into a stiff ridge along his spine, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his throat that vibrated through the wood of the deck. I set my mug down on the railing, the dark liquid trembling in concentric rings, and looked toward the dense tree line to the north where the access road disappeared into the shadows of the canopy. A flock of crows erupted from the treetops, screaming into the sky in a chaotic black cloud, their panic a herald of something unnatural. Then came the sound, a mechanical, grinding roar of engines pushing hard against the incline, followed immediately by the high-pitched, piercing whine of a siren that I had not heard in 30 years. My stomach dropped as if I had stepped off a cliff ledge. It was the perimeter alarm I had installed in the summer of 1995, a military-grade sensor system I had purchased through a mail-order catalog under a false name. The one I prayed every single night would never go off. The siren wailed, a banshee scream that echoed off the canyon walls, announcing that the boundary I had so carefully constructed around my life had been breached. I did not run, for my knees were ruined from 40 years of logging and lifting. But I moved with a cold, grim purpose that defied my age. I turned back into the cabin, the screen door slamming shut behind me, and walked past the unwashed dishes and the stack of books on the table to the mudroom. There, leaning against the wall in the shadows, was my Winchester lever-action rifle, a tool I kept cleaned and oiled not for hunting deer, but for this specific moment. I grabbed the cold steel barrel, my thumb checking the safety out of muscle memory, and grabbed a box of ammunition from the shelf. My hands, usually steady when carving wood or dressing a wound, trembled slightly, not from the palsy of age, but from the adrenaline dumping into my bloodstream. This was the nightmare scenario, the day I had dreaded since the winter of 1998 when I first brought the secret home. I stepped back onto the porch, the rifle held across my chest, and raised the scope to my eye to scan the winding scar of dirt and gravel that served as my driveway. It should not have been passable this early in the spring, as the mud was thick enough to swallow a truck to the axles, but whoever was coming had come prepared. Through the magnified glass, I saw them. 3 black SUVs, large and aggressive, tearing around the bend with mud spraying from their heavy all-terrain tires. They had no license plates that I could see, no Forest Service decals, and no sheriff markings. They were ghosts, dark silhouettes against the green and white of the mountain, moving with a synchronized aggression that spoke of government funding or private military contractors. They were coming for the barn. I lowered the rifle, my breath hitching in my throat as the reality of the situation settled over me like a heavy, wet blanket. I had rigged a property with sensors. I had bought the silence of the few neighbors I had within a 10-mile radius, and I had lived like a hermit, a ghost in my own life, all to prevent this exact moment. But as the lead vehicle smashed through the wooden gate I had built by hand, sending splinters flying into the air, I realized that my preparations were nothing against the sheer force of the outside world. I looked toward the barn, a massive structure reinforced with steel and timber, standing silent and imposing 100 yards from the main house. Inside that barn was the reason for my isolation, the reason for the alarm, and the reason my heart was currently hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I whistled for Buster, ordering him to stay on the porch, though the old dog was pacing anxiously, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The convoy was closing the distance, the engines roaring louder now, drowning out the wind and the birds. I had perhaps 2 minutes before they were at my doorstep. I debated running to the barn, barring the doors and making my stand there. But I knew it would be futile. If they knew enough to come with 3 vehicles and heavy tires, they knew what was inside. They had not come to ask questions. They had come to take. I tightened my grip on the rifle, not because I intended to start a war I could not win, but because holding it made me feel less like a helpless old man and more like the protector I had sworn to be. The lead SUV skidded to a halt in the gravel turnaround, the dust cloud overtaking it, and the doors flew open before the wheels had even stopped turning. Men in tactical gear spilled out, moving with practiced efficiency, their faces obscured, their weapons drawn. I stood on my porch, 65 years old, alone and terrified, watching the end of my world arrive in high definition. The silence of the Cabinet Mountains was gone, murdered by the noise of men. And I knew that the peace I had cherished was gone with it, replaced by a cold, hard reckoning. To understand why a 65-year-old man would rig military-grade motion sensors around a 40-acre plot of worthless timber and face down a heavily armed tactical team with nothing but a lever-action rifle, you have to go back to the winter of 1998. I was a younger man then, 40 years old and made of gristle and stubbornness, working as a contract logger before my knees gave out and my back stiffened into a permanent ache. That winter was not just a season. It was an assault. A blizzard had hammered the valley for 3 days straight, a relentless white fury that dumped 5 feet of snow on the Cabinet Mountains and snapped power lines like cotton thread, plunging the entire region into a frozen, prehistoric darkness. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, the silence that followed was heavy and absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the sound right out of the air. I took my snowmobile out to check the northern property line, the engine whining high and thin in the frigid air as I carved a path through the powder. The world was a blinding white sheet, erased of all landmarks, until I saw the scar. An entire section of the ridge had given way during the height of the storm, a slab avalanche that had shorn the face of the mountain clean and carried trees, boulders, and ice down into the ravine in a chaotic slurry of destruction. I killed the engine, and in the sudden quiet, I heard it. It was not the wind, nor was it the settling of the snow. It was a low, rhythmic keening, a sound of distress that vibrated in the hollow of my chest. At first I assumed it was a moose or perhaps an elk, tangled in the debris and doomed to freeze. But the timbre was wrong. It was too deep, too resonant, and strangely, terrifyingly vocal. Driven by a curiosity that outweighed my common sense, I strapped on my snowshoes, grabbed a coil of rope and a shovel from the sled, and began the treacherous descent into the ravine. The debris field was a graveyard of shattered timber, jagged rocks, and ice boulders the size of compact cars. I climbed over the trunk of a 200-year-old pine that had been snapped like a matchstick, my breath pluming in white clouds before me. When I finally got close enough to identify the source of the sound, I froze, my brain struggling to process the visual information it was receiving. It was not a moose. It was a man. Or at least, the shape was humanoid, buried to the chest in a slurry of mud and compacted snow that had frozen as hard as concrete. But no man was that broad across the shoulders, and no man was covered in thick, matted dark fur that was silvering at the tips like the coat of an old timber wolf. He was unconscious when I reached him, his massive head lolling forward, his breathing shallow and rapid, sending up faint wisps of steam from a chest that was as wide as a rain barrel. My first instinct, the primal one that lives in the lizard brain of every human being, screamed at me to run. I should have scrambled back up that slope, started my snowmobile, and driven until I reached the sheriff's office in Libby. Every campfire story, every whispered legend of the Sasquatch, every warning about the monsters in the woods came flooding back with paralyzing clarity. This was an apex predator, a creature of immense power, capable of ripping a man apart with its bare hands. But then, as if sensing my presence, he opened his eyes. They were not the black, soulless beads of a shark, nor the wild, reactive eyes of a bear. They were amber, bright and clear, with round pupils that focused on me with a shocking, undeniable intelligence. In those eyes, I did not see aggression or hunger. I saw a depth of terror and pain that hit me harder than the sub-zero wind. He looked at me, then down at his trapped legs, and let out a whimper that sounded heartbreakingly like a frightened child. In that second, the monster vanished, replaced by a suffering, living being asking for mercy. I spent 6 hours in that ravine, waging a war against the ice and the mountain itself. I broke 2 shovels trying to chip away the frozen mud that encased his lower body. I used a fallen branch as a fulcrum, straining until my muscles screamed and my vision spotted with exertion, trying to leverage a 1,000-pound Douglas fir off his legs. Throughout the ordeal, the creature never tried to bite or strike me. He watched me with those golden eyes, tracking my movements, wincing and groaning when the debris shifted, but remaining eerily still, as if he understood that I was his only chance. When I finally managed to lift the log just enough to free him, the damage was catastrophic. His left leg was shattered, twisted at a sickening angle that made my own stomach turn. He could not walk. He could barely drag himself. I realized then that I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. If I left him, he would die of exposure or shock before the sun went down. If I called for help, men with tranquilizer darts and cages would descend, and his life as a free being would be over. He would become a specimen, a headline, a prisoner. I dragged the heavy plastic sled tarp down from the snowmobile, and with an effort that nearly ruptured a disc in my back, I helped him crawl onto it. He was heavy, dense with muscle and bone, easily 400 pounds of dead weight. The journey back up the slope and the tow to the barn was a slow, agonizing crawl, the snowmobile engine whining in protest as I towed the most significant biological discovery in human history under a tarp. By the time we reached the barn, the sun had dipped below the peaks, casting the world in blood-red light. I hauled him inside, into the warmth of the hayloft and the reinforced structure that had once held tractors and livestock. I treated his leg with horse liniment and fashioned splints from PVC pipe and duct tape, working by the light of a kerosene lantern while he watched me, his breathing slowly steadying. That night, as I barred the heavy doors from the inside and listened to the wind howl against the timber, the logger Elias Thorne died, and the keeper was born. I looked at him, resting in the hay, a giant brought low by the mountain. And I knew I could not call him it or the creature. He needed a name. I named him Silas, after my grandfather who had built this cabin, a man of few words and great strength. Silas looked at me when I spoke the name, his amber eyes reflecting the lamplight. And a silent pact was formed in the dusty air of that barn, a promise of protection that would cost me everything I had and everything I was going to be. Silas was not a pet, and to think of him as such would be a gross misunderstanding of the dynamic that evolved between us in the solitude of that barn. He was a roommate, a tenant, a brother, and at times, a silent god who watched over my small, fragile life with a patience that shamed me. For the first year after I pulled him from the ravine, he lived in the hayloft of my reinforced barn, a space that smelled of dry alfalfa, old engine oil, and the heavy, musky scent of his own body, which was not unpleasant but smelled distinctly of wet earth and pine resin. I treated his shattered leg with gallons of horse liniment and makeshift splints I fashioned from 4-inch PVC pipe and rolls of silver duct tape, setting the bones as best I could with my limited knowledge of anatomy. His recovery was nothing short of miraculous, a testament to a biology that evolution had perfected in the dark corners of the world where soft things do not survive. A human with those injuries would have been crippled for life, limping on a cane and swallowing painkillers until their liver failed. But Silas healed with a terrifying speed. His metabolism ran hot, burning like a furnace, and I could feel the heat radiating off him from 3 feet away. This biological fire required fuel, and the logistics of feeding him became the primary architecture of my existence. He burned through calories at a rate that defied physics, consuming 40 to 50 pounds of protein a week during the winter months. I became the most lethal hunter in the valley, not out of sport, but out of necessity, taking elk and deer out of season and dragging them home under the cover of darkness, telling the few people I encountered in town that I had developed a taste for jerky and was selling the rest to friends in Idaho. We did not use flashcards or sign language, for those are human constructs designed for human minds, and Silas was something else entirely. We used look and intent, a communication stripped of the deceit of words. He knew when I was sad or aching from the cold. On those nights, he would sit quietly near the edge of the loft and hum a low, vibrating note deep in his chest. It was not a song, but a frequency, a subsonic rumble that I felt in my teeth and my spine more than I heard with my ears. It was an infrasound, similar to what elephants use to communicate across miles of savanna, and it had a profound physiological effect on me. The vibration seemed to calm my nervous system, lowering my blood pressure and stilling the tremors in my hands, acting as a balm for the anxiety that came with harboring a secret that could bring the federal government down on my head. Conversely, I knew when he was restless or in pain without him making a sound. He would pace the length of the barn, his heavy, padded feet moving silently despite his bulk, trailing his long fingers along the rough-hewn timber walls as if reading the history of the wood. The hardest part of those 2 decades was not the hunting, the butchering, or the constant fear of discovery. It was the isolation. To keep him safe, I had to become a ghost. I stopped inviting friends over for poker. I let my subscription to the local paper lapse. I stopped going to church in Libby. I bought groceries in bulk once every 3 months at a 24-hour supercenter in Spokane, driving 4 hours each way in the middle of the night so that no local clerk would notice a single old man buying enough rice and beans to feed a platoon. I built a secondary wall inside the barn, creating a soundproof room lined with acoustic foam and old mattresses, a bunker within a bunker where he could retreat if anyone ever came up the driveway. Silas understood the game we were playing. He possessed an acute, almost paranoid intelligence regarding the outside world. He knew that the small, hairless things that drove the metal beetles on the roads meant danger. He knew that the sound of an engine meant he had to be still, absolute and stone-like, blending into the shadows until he was nothing more than a pile of old hay or a stack of lumber. But as the years ground on, marking the passage of time and the graying of my beard and the silvering of the fur on his shoulders, the world outside began to change. The silence of the 1990s, the deep, isolated quiet that had allowed us to exist, began to erode. It started slowly, with the appearance of satellite mapping on the internet. I remember the first time I saw my own property on a computer screen at the library, the resolution grainy but unmistakable, and the cold sweat that broke out on my neck when I realized that the sky was no longer empty. Then came the drones. It was the summer of 2010 when the first one buzzed over the treetops, a white plastic quadcopter flown by some tourist or real estate agent miles away. The sound was like a swarm of angry hornets, a high-pitched mechanical whine that sent Buster into a frenzy. Silas, who was in the outdoor enclosure I had built behind the barn, a high-fenced run disguised by thick ivy and tarps, panicked. For the first time in years, he roared, a sound of primal terror that shook the dust from the rafters. I had to tackle him, physically throwing my weight against his massive thigh to get his attention, shouting at him to get inside. That night, I bought the first components of the perimeter alarm system, realizing that the wilderness was no longer a wall, but a window that anyone could look through. We adapted, because that is what survivors do. The barn became our entire universe. I brought a television out there, running a cable from the main house, and in the long, dark winters of Montana, we would sit together on the old leather sofa I had dragged into his quarters. He was fascinated by the glowing box, by the window it offered into a world he could never visit. He preferred nature documentaries, specifically those narrated by voices that were calm and low. I remember one night in particular, in the winter of 2014. We were watching a program about the Amazon rainforest. The screen showed a troop of howler monkeys moving through the canopy, calling to one another, grooming, fighting, living in a chaotic, vibrant community. Silas sat transfixed, his amber eyes unblinking, his body leaning forward until his nose was inches from the glass. He watched them interact, watched the mothers holding their infants, watched the males posturing. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. He pointed a long, dark finger at the screen, then turned it around and pointed at his own chest. His expression was open, inquisitive, and devastating. He was asking if they were him. He was asking if he had people. I had to shake my head. I could not lie to him. "No," I whispered, my voice thick with a grief I could not articulate. "They are not you, Silas. You are. You are the only one here. You are the last one I know." He looked at me for a long time, the light from the television reflecting in his eyes. And then he looked back at the screen. He did not make the humming sound that night. He did not pace. He simply slumped, his massive shoulders curving inward, diminishing himself. The loneliness that radiated off him was a physical weight, heavier than the snow on the roof, heavier than the timber in the ravine. It was the crushing realization that he was an island in a sea of humanity, a singular point of existence with no reflection in the world. That night haunted me for a decade, driving a wedge of guilt into my heart. I had saved his life, yes, but I had also become his jailer, trapping him in a world of silence and shadows, where his only companion was an aging logger who could never truly understand the depth of his solitude. As I aged, the fear of what would happen after I was gone began to consume me. I was 65, and my body was failing. My heart had developed a murmur, my knees were bone on bone, and I knew that I could not protect him forever. I began to hoard money, stuffing cash into coffee cans buried in the floorboards, delusional plans of setting up a trust or buying more land. But deep down I knew it was futile. Silas was an impossibility, a biological anomaly that the world would destroy the moment it discovered him, and the world was getting closer every day. Hikers with high-definition action cameras strapped to their chests were pushing further into the wilderness, ignoring no trespassing signs. The town of Libby was expanding, bringing more lights, more noise, more people. The silence was dying. I spent my nights checking the monitors of the security system, watching the green-hued feeds of the forest, waiting for the inevitable intrusion. Silas seemed to sense my anxiety. He became more protective, sleeping near the door of the barn, his sleep light and fitful. He would often wake me by gently touching my shoulder, his eyes wide and alert, pointing toward the window, hearing things my old ears missed. We were two old soldiers guarding a fortress that was slowly crumbling around us, bound together by a secret that was too heavy to carry and too precious to drop. The peace of the mountains was a lie we told ourselves, a thin veneer over the encroaching chaos. And as I sat on the porch that morning with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the peaks, I think I knew, in the way that old men know when the weather is turning, that the storm was finally here. The vibration on the deck was not just a truck. It was the end of the world as we knew it, the final shattering of the glass bubble we had lived in for 24 years. The perimeter alarm wailed, and I knew that the ghost in the barn was about to become real to a world that would show him no mercy. The crisis, when it finally arrived, did not come in the form of a government helicopter sweeping over the ridge with a spotlight, nor did it come as a squad of federal agents kicking down my front door with warrants and weapons. It arrived on the back of an insect no larger than a sesame seed, a tiny, mindless vector of destruction that cared nothing for secrets or species boundaries. It was late August of the year 2021, a season of oppressive, suffocating heat that turned the Cabinet Mountains into a dry kiln. The air was thick with smoke from wildfires burning 300 miles away in Oregon, casting a perpetual sickly yellow haze over the valley that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat with ash. I'd been on high alert all summer, watching the perimeter monitors for signs of firefighters or evacuation crews. But the woods remained quiet, save for the relentless, sawing buzz of the cicadas. Silas had been lethargic for a week, but I had attributed it to the heat and the smoke, keeping him inside the barn during the day with industrial fans running to circulate the stagnant air. He lay on his mattress of hay and acoustic foam, panting softly, his massive chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed slightly too fast, but not alarmingly so. I brought him troughs of cool water from the deep well, which he drank with a thirsty desperation. But he refused the venison I had thawed, turning his head away with a low rumble of nausea. It was on the evening of the third day of his fast that I found it. I was grooming him, a daily ritual we had established years ago to check for burrs and parasites, using a stiff, bristled horse brush to comb through the thick, matted fur on his back and shoulders. He usually enjoyed this, leaning into the pressure like a cat. But that night he flinched when I brushed the sensitive skin behind his left ear. I parted the coarse, dark hair, using the flashlight from my phone to see, and my stomach turned over. There, buried deep in the flesh, was the swollen and gorged body of a deer tick, its abdomen distended and gray. Surrounding the bite was not just a red bump, but a spreading, angry bullseye rash the size of a dinner plate, the skin hot and tight to the touch. It was a classic, terrifying sign of infection, but on a scale I had never seen. I removed the tick with tweezers, my hands shaking as I dropped it into a jar of alcohol, and immediately cleaned the wound with antiseptic. But deep down, I knew I was already too late. The pathogen was in his blood. By the next morning, the barn had become a house of horrors. The sickness did not creep up on him. It hit him with the force of a freight train. I found him thrashing on his bed, tangled in the heavy wool blankets, letting out sounds I had never heard in 23 years, high-pitched, keening wails that sounded like metal tearing under stress. His body temperature was skyrocketing. When I pressed my hand to his forehead, it felt like touching a cast-iron stove. I did not have a thermometer capable of measuring a creature of his physiology, but he was burning up, radiating a dry, furious heat that seemed to raise the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. He was shaking, suffering from rigors so violent that his 600-pound frame actually rattled the heavy timber support beams of the loft. Dust drifted down from the rafters in a fine, gray snow as he convulsed, his muscles locking and releasing in spasms of agony. I went into emergency mode, the panic kept at bay only by the necessity of action. I ran a garden hose from the spigot outside into the barn, spraying him down with cold well water to try and break the fever. Steam actually rose from his fur where the water hit him, but the relief was temporary. As soon as the water evaporated, the heat returned, fiercer than before. I raided my stockpile of medicine, crushing 30 aspirin tablets into a fine white powder and mixing it with water, trying to coax him to drink. He gagged and choked, spitting half of it out, his throat swollen and raw. I had a bottle of broad-spectrum antibiotics, amoxicillin, I had bought from a veterinary supplier under the pretense of treating a sick horse, but I had no idea of the dosage. Too little would do nothing. Too much could destroy his kidneys. I made a guess based on his weight, dissolving the massive pills in apple juice, and managed to get him to swallow the mixture, praying to a God I had not spoken to in decades that it would be enough. It was not enough. The second day of the sickness was a blur of exhaustion and terror. Silas began to hallucinate. This was the most frightening thing I had ever witnessed. An apex predator, possessed of immense strength, striking out at enemies only he could see. He would suddenly roar, a sound that vibrated in the marrow of my bones, and swipe his massive arms through the air, shattering a wooden crate and sending tools flying across the room. I had to stay out of reach, crouching in the corner of the soundproof room, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice, trying to anchor him to reality. "It is me, Silas. It is Elias. You are safe. There is nothing there." Occasionally, his amber eyes would lock onto mine, but there was no recognition in them, only a glassy, delirious haze of pain. He looked through me, seeing fire or monsters, or perhaps the memories of the avalanche that had trapped him so long ago. He was drowning in his own body, his lungs filling with fluid, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps that sounded like a death rattle. I did not sleep. I could not leave him. I sat by his side as the hours dragged into the third night, changing the cold compresses on his head, sponging water into his mouth, and watching the creature I loved like a brother slowly disintegrate. The smell of the barn changed. It no longer smelled of pine and hay. It smelled of sickness, a sharp, metallic tang of copper and sour sweat that caught in my throat. I felt a crushing sense of impotence. I was a carpenter, a logger, a man who fixed things with his hands. I could rebuild a transmission, frame a house, or splint a broken leg, but I could not fight a microscopic enemy destroying him from the inside out. I was watching him die, and the realization was a physical weight pressing the air out of my own lungs. The turning point came at 3 a.m. on the fourth day. The violent thrashing had stopped, replaced by a stillness that was even more terrifying. Silas lay on his side, his breathing shallow and rapid, his massive chest barely moving. I moved closer, disregarding the danger, and took his hand. It was limp and heavy, the leather pads of his palm dry and cracked. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in days the delirium seemed to clear. The amber light was dim, fading like a dying ember, but he saw me. He really saw me. He looked at my face, wet with tears and grime, and then he looked around the barn, the only home he had known for a quarter of a century. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, and I saw it happen. The spark of fight went out. He was tired. He was in agony, and he was done. He squeezed my hand, a weak, trembling pressure that broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. It was a goodbye. He was releasing me from my obligation. He was telling me that it was okay, that he was ready to go, that the pain was too much. He closed his eyes and turned his head away, preparing to die in the dark, just as he had almost died in the ravine all those years ago. "No," I whispered, the words scraping out of my throat like gravel. "No, you do not get to do that. You do not get to quit on me." I stood up, my knees cracking, adrenaline flooding my system with a cold, clarifying focus. I could not save him. I did not have the tools, the medicine, or the knowledge, but there were people who did. For 23 years, I had lived by one rule: absolute secrecy. Silence was survival. To speak was to kill him. But now, the silence was killing him anyway. If I did nothing, he would be dead by sunrise. If I spoke, they might take him, they might imprison him, but he might live. It was a choice between a definite death and a desperate gamble. I turned and ran out of the barn, sprinting across the moonlit yard to the cabin with a speed I did not know I possessed. I burst into the house, knocking over a chair in my haste, and sat down at my dusty desk. My computer was an old model, air-gapped and secured, used only for ordering supplies and reading the news. I booted it up, the fan whirring loudly in the quiet room, and connected to the satellite internet. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating to a corner of the deep web I had lurked on for a decade but never touched. It was a forum called the Cryptozoological Exchange, a hub for crackpots, hoaxers, and dreamers. But buried within it was a sub-forum, an invite-only board for serious researchers and sympathizers. I had hacked my way in years ago, purely to monitor what people knew, to see if anyone was getting close to the truth. I had seen a user there, someone with the handle Veritas Med. They spoke with authority, debunking fake autopsies, discussing the theoretical biology of hominids with the vocabulary of a trauma surgeon. They had mentioned once, in a thread about injured wildlife, that they worked for a private conservation group funded by tech money, a group that handled sensitive biological assets. It was a shot in the dark, a whisper in a hurricane, but it was all I had. I opened a secure private message window. My cursor blinked against the black background, a rhythmic pulse counting down the seconds of Silas's life. I hesitated. Once I pressed send, there was no going back. I was ending my life as I knew it. I was inviting the world into my sanctuary. I was betraying the promise I had made to keep him hidden. But then I remembered the feel of his hand, the heat radiating off his body, the look of resignation in his eyes. I did not care about my safety. I did not care about the government. I only cared that he breathed. I typed 3 words, my fingers hitting the keys with the force of hammer strikes. I have proof. Help. I added my encrypted coordinates, took a breath that tasted of ashes and fear, and hit enter. The message vanished into the digital void, and I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, waiting for the monsters or the angels to answer. The response from the digital void was not a question, nor was it a negotiation. It was a set of coordinates and a timeline that appeared on my screen with a terrifying, sterile finality. The cursor blinked 3 times, and then the message from the user known as Veritas Med scrolled across the black monitor in neon green text that burned itself into my retinas. It read, "Asset acknowledged. Viral pathology suspected based on description. Do not administer further oral antibiotics. Keep subject hydrated but immobile. Recovery team is inbound. Estimated time of arrival is 6 hours. Do not contact local emergency services. Do not leave the property. We are the only ones who can save him." I sat back in my creaking wooden chair, the breath leaving my lungs in a long, shuddering exhale that tasted of stale coffee and fear. I had done it. I had pulled the trigger on the signal flare I had kept hidden for 23 years. And now there was no way to stuff the genie back into the bottle. The silence of the Cabinet Mountains, which I had guarded with the ferocity of a zealot, was about to be broken by strangers, and I had invited them in. The next 6 hours were the longest of my life, a period of time that stretched and warped like taffy in the heat. I did not sleep. I could not eat. I paced the floor of the cabin, checking the windows every 5 minutes, my hand drifting constantly to the radio on my belt, though there was no one to call. The sun began to bleed over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, illuminating the smoke haze from the distant fires. It should have been beautiful, but it looked apocalyptic. I returned to the barn, moving through the pre-dawn gloom like a man walking to the gallows. Inside, the air was thick and hot, smelling of sickness and damp hay. Silas was still alive, but barely. He lay on his side, his massive chest hitching with every breath, the rattle in his lungs sounding wetter and deeper than before. I sat beside him, taking his limp hand in mine. His skin was dry and burning hot, the fever consuming him from the inside out. "They are coming, buddy," I whispered, my voice cracking in the quiet. "Help is coming. You just have to hold on. You just have to fight for a little bit longer." He did not open his eyes, but his ear twitched slightly at the sound of my voice, a microscopic acknowledgement that shattered me. I spent the time cleaning him, using warm water and a sponge to wipe the sweat and grime from his face, trying to give him some dignity before the strangers arrived. I brushed the matted fur on his arms, straightening his limbs, talking to him constantly about the mountains, about the snow, about the day I found him. I told him stories he already knew, weaving a tapestry of our life together to keep him tethered to this world. When the sun was fully up, casting hard, unforgiving shadows across the yard, the sound arrived. It was not the chop of a helicopter, which I had feared, but the low, aggressive rumble of high-performance engines tearing up the gravel access road. I walked out of the barn and stood on the porch, squinting against the glare. 3 black SUVs, large, armored, and utterly devoid of markings, rounded the bend. They moved with a predatory grace, their suspension eating up the ruts and potholes that would have broken a lesser vehicle. They did not slow down until they reached the gate, which I had left open. They rolled into the yard in a tight formation, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the stagnant air. The engines cut simultaneously, plunging the yard back into silence. But it was a tense, expectant silence, not the peace I was used to. The doors opened, and the men who stepped out were not the park rangers or local deputies I had spent decades avoiding. These were professionals. They wore tactical gear that looked expensive and well-used, black cargo pants, moisture-wicking shirts, heavy boots, but no unit patches, no names, no flags. They moved with the economy of motion that comes from years of drilling. They did not look at the mountains. They scanned the perimeter, their hands resting near the sidearms strapped to their thighs. Then, from the middle vehicle, a woman emerged. She was different. She wore a pristine white lab coat over gray scrubs, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, tight bun. She carried a metallic case in one hand and a tablet in the other. She walked straight toward me, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked. Her voice was calm, modulated, and utterly devoid of the awe or confusion I usually saw when city people came this far out. "I am Elias Thorne," I said, stepping off the porch to meet her. My hand hovered near the knife in my pocket, a useless gesture against the firepower surrounding me, but a comforting one. "You are Veritas?" "I am Dr. Eris," she corrected, removing her sunglasses to reveal eyes the color of steel. "Veritas is the organization. We received your distress call regarding a biological asset in critical condition. Lyme carditis with secondary pneumonia, based on your description. Is the subject still viable?" The word asset grated on my nerves like sandpaper, but I swallowed my anger. "His name is Silas," I said, my voice hard. "And he is dying. He is in the barn." She nodded once, sharp and efficient. "Lead the way." She gestured to the men, and 4 of them grabbed heavy Pelican-style cases from the back of the SUVs and followed us. There was no hesitation, no questions about what, exactly, was in the barn. As we walked across the yard, I felt a spike of paranoia. How did they know not to ask? How did they know exactly what they were walking into? Most people, even cryptozoologists, would be brimming with questions, asking for proof before they unloaded the gear. These people acted like they were answering a call to fix a broken HVAC unit. I slid the heavy barn door open, the rusted track screaming in protest. The gloom inside was sudden and heavy. I walked to the soundproof room and opened the inner door. The smell of sickness rolled out, pungent and overwhelming. Dr. Eris did not flinch. She stepped inside, clicking on a high-powered flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on Silas. I expected a gasp. I expected her to recoil, or to freeze, or to drop her case in shock. I expected the reaction every human being has when they first lay eyes on a 7-foot-tall, 600-pound relic of the Pleistocene era, but there was nothing. No gasp, no widening of the eyes. She simply walked up to the mattress, knelt beside him, and placed a hand on his neck to check his pulse. Heart rate is steady, approximately 120 beats per minute, she announced to the room, her tone conversational. Respiration is labored. Severe fluid accumulation in the lungs. We need to intubate and start aggressive antibiotic therapy immediately. Get the line in. The men moved past me, setting up a mobile field hospital with terrifying speed. They opened the cases to reveal gleaming medical equipment, monitors, oxygen tanks, bags of fluid, sterile instruments. One of the men, a burly guy with a shaved head, moved to Silas's head and pried open his jaw with a metal retractor. Silas groaned weakly, a sound of distress, and I stepped forward instinctively. "Easy," I said, putting a hand on the man's shoulder. "He is scared. Do not hurt him." The man looked at me, then at Dr. Eris. Eris did not look up from where she was shaving a patch of fur on Silas's arm to find a vein. "Mr. Thorne, step back. We are saving his life. Your emotional attachment is noted, but you are in the way." I froze, the rebuke stinging. But she was right. They were working. The man inserted a laryngoscope into Silas's throat, guiding a plastic tube down his windpipe. Another man hooked up a portable ventilator, and with a hiss of compressed air, the machine began to breathe for him. The rhythm of the bellows was steady, mechanical, and reassuring. On the monitor they had set up, a green line traced the erratic beating of Silas's heart. Dr. Eris found the vein in his massive forearm, a vein as thick as a garden hose, and inserted a large bore needle. She hung 2 bags on a portable stand, one clear, saline for hydration, and one filled with a milky yellow liquid. Broad-spectrum antibiotics and a proprietary antiviral cocktail, she explained without me asking. We see this reaction in isolated megafauna when they come into contact with modern vectors. His immune system has no context for the pathogen. It is a cytokine storm. We are suppressing the immune response while killing the bacteria. I stood in the corner, pressing my back against the rough wood of the wall, watching them work on my brother. It was surreal. The juxtaposition of the dirty, haze-strewn barn and the high-tech, sterile violence of modern medicine was jarring. They poked him, prodded him, hooked him up to wires and tubes, turning the wild, mythical creature into a patient. A patient, not a monster. For an hour, the only sounds in the barn were the beep of the monitor and the hiss of the ventilator. I watched the green line on the screen. Slowly, agonizingly, the numbers began to change. The heart rate dropped from 120 to 100, then to 90. The oxygen saturation climbed from a terrifying 70% to 90%. The fever, which had been radiating off him in waves, seemed to break, sweat beading on his forehead, not from heat, but from the cooling of his body. Dr. Eris stood up, peeling off her latex gloves. She looked tired, but satisfied. She turned to me, and for the first time, her expression softened slightly. "He is stabilizing," she said. "We caught it just in time. Another hour and the cardiac stress would have caused total organ failure." I let out a sob. I had not realized I was holding back, my knees buckling. I slid down the wall until I was sitting in the dust, burying my face in my hands. "Thank you," I wept. "Oh God, thank you." "Do not thank me yet," she said, her voice clipping the end of my relief. "This is triage. He is not out of the woods. We cannot treat him here long-term. He needs a sterile environment, constant monitoring, and specialized care that we can only provide at our facility. I looked up, wiping my eyes with the back of my dirty hand. Facility? What facility? We have a sanctuary, she said, crouching down so she was at eye level with me. Her voice was persuasive, smooth like a river stone. It is in Colorado, a private reserve, thousands of acres of fenced wilderness, strictly no-fly zone, completely off the grid. We have a full veterinary hospital on site. We have others there, Mr. Thorne. He would be safe. He would be protected. And he would be alive. The words hung in the air, glittering with promise. A sanctuary, a place where he could be safe without me having to hide him in a barn, a place where he could run, a place where there might be others. It was the dream I had barely dared to dream for 20 years. It was the solution to my aging body, to my fear of dying and leaving him alone. It was perfect. And because it was perfect, I should have known it was a lie. But desperation makes you blind, and relief makes you stupid. I looked at Silas, sleeping peacefully now, the machine breathing for him, the pain gone from his face. I looked at Dr. Eris, with her clean white coat and her competent hands. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the world was kind, that there were people out there who cared about the wonder of existence as much as I did. Okay, I whispered. Okay, take him, but I am coming with him. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, a micro expression of annoyance that vanished before I could fully register it. Of course, she said. We would not expect you to leave him. You are his primary bond. Your presence would be essential for his rehabilitation. She stood up and snapped her fingers. Prepare for transport. We lift in 20 minutes. The men moved with renewed purpose. They brought in a massive, reinforced stretcher made of carbon fiber and steel mesh. It looked like something designed to carry a rhinoceros. They disconnected the monitors but kept the ventilator and the IVs running, transferring the bags to hooks on the stretcher frame. It took all 6 of the men, plus me, to lift Silas onto the device. He was dead weight, heavy and limp, a mountain of fur and muscle. We strapped him down with heavy nylon webbing, securing his chest, his waist, and his legs. I tucked the blanket around his shoulders, a small domestic gesture in the midst of the tactical operation. We have a heavy lift transport jet waiting at the airstrip in Libby, Eris said as we wheeled him out of the barn and into the bright, blinding sunlight of the afternoon. It is a short flight. He will be waking up in the Rockies. I walked beside the stretcher, my hand resting on Silas's shoulder. The sun felt good on my face. The nightmare of the last 4 days was receding, replaced by a strange, buoyant hope. I looked at my cabin, the small, lonely structure where I had spent half my life hiding. I looked at the trees, the mountains I loved. I was leaving it all behind. I would have to pack a bag. I would have to lock the door. I would probably never come back. And I realized, with a shock, that I did not care. As long as Silas was safe, nothing else mattered. The men loaded the stretcher into the back of a large box truck that had arrived silently while we were inside, a vehicle equipped with a hydraulic lift gate. They secured the wheels, checking the straps one last time. Dr. Eris hopped into the back with him, checking the monitors. "Go pack your things, Mr. Thorne," she called out to me. "Quickly. We are burning daylight, and his vitals are stable but fragile. We need to be in the air within the hour." I nodded and turned toward the house. My heart felt lighter than it had in years. I was going to save him. We had won. The secret was out, but it had landed in the hands of angels. I bounded up the steps to the porch, my mind already racing with what I needed to bring, my journals, the photos, Silas's favorite blanket. I grabbed my duffel bag from the closet and started throwing clothes into it. I grabbed the old picture of my grandfather. I grabbed the jar of cash from under the floorboards, though I doubted I would need it in a billionaire's sanctuary. I felt a surge of gratitude for the user Veritas Med. for the technology that had saved us. I walked back out onto the porch, zipping up the bag. The box truck was idling, its exhaust rumbling. The black SUVs were lined up, engines running. It was a convoy of salvation. But as I stepped down the stairs, something made me pause. It was a small thing, a detail. One of the tactical officers was standing by the back of the truck, talking into a headset. He was not looking at Silas with concern. He was not looking at the mountains. He was looking at his watch, and he was smiling. Not a smile of relief, but a smile of a job well done, a smile of cold satisfaction. And then I noticed something else. In all the time they had been here, in all the time they had worked on the most incredible biological discovery of the century, not one of them had taken a photograph. Not one of them had pulled out a phone to snap a picture of the Bigfoot. They acted like they had seen 100 of him. They acted like he was just cargo. A cold splinter of ice worked its way into my gut. The joy began to curdle. I looked at the black vehicles, at the lack of license plates, at the military precision. Private conservation groups are passionate. They are messy. They cry. They take pictures. These people were not passionate. They were efficient. I gripped the handle of my duffel bag tighter. The perimeter alarm had warned me of an intrusion, but I had opened the gate. I had let them in. And as Dr. Eris stepped out of the truck and walked toward me, pulling off her latex gloves with a sharp snap, I looked into her steel-gray eyes and realized that the relief I had felt was a narcotic, and it was beginning to wear off. The silence of the mountains fell suddenly very loud and very, very empty. The rescue was over. The erasure was about to begin. Here is the revised Chapter 6, incorporating the logical fix regarding the biological threat and Elias's forced isolation. They loaded him into the back of the transport truck with a mechanical efficiency that should have warned me, a seamless integration of man and machine that treated my friend, my brother, not as a patient, but as a payload. I stood on the porch of the cabin, the duffel bag heavy in my hand, watching the hydraulic liftgate whine and hiss as it raised the reinforced stretcher into the dark maw of the cargo hold. The sun was fully up now, bleaching the color out of the mountains and casting stark, unforgiving shadows across the gravel driveway, exposing every weed and rut. I felt a vibration of nervous energy in my chest, a flutter of hope that felt like a trapped bird. But beneath it, the cold splinter of doubt I had felt earlier began to twist and dig deeper. I adjusted the strap of the bag on my shoulder, checking for the third time that I had my wallet, my keys, and the small leather-bound journal where I had documented every day of the last 23 years. I was ready to leave. I was ready to vanish. I stepped down the stairs, my boots crunching on the frost-heaved ground, and walked toward the convoy. Dr. Eris was standing at the rear of the truck, peeling off her latex gloves with a sharp, snapping sound that echoed in the quiet valley. She handed the gloves to one of the tactical officers, who placed them into a biohazard bag without a word. She smoothed the front of her white lab coat, checked something on her tablet, and then turned to face me. He stopped 2 feet away, creating a boundary of personal space that felt intentional and rigid. Her eyes, steel gray and devoid of the fatigue that I felt down to my marrow, scanned my face, then dropped to the duffel bag in my hand, and then returned to my eyes. There was a shift in her demeanor, a subtle hardening of the features that stripped away the veneer of the compassionate healer and revealed the bureaucrat beneath. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice level and cool, carrying easily over the low idle of the diesel engines. "You have done a remarkable thing here, truly. Keeping a biological specimen of this magnitude alive for 2 decades in a non-sterile, uncontrolled environment is unprecedented. The data you have provided, inadvertently or not, regarding his dietary requirements and behavioral adaptations is invaluable." The word specimen hit me like a physical slap, stinging my cheek. It was a word that belonged in a laboratory, in a jar of formaldehyde, not in the open air of the Montana wilderness where Silas had breathed and lived. "He is not a specimen," I said, my voice roughening with a sudden surge of defensiveness. "He is Silas, and I am ready. Where do I sit? In the truck with him? Or in one of the SUVs?" Dr. Eris smiled, but it was a tight, pitying expression that did not reach her eyes. It was the smile a parent gives a child who has asked a foolish question. "I am afraid that is not possible, Elias. The facility is classified top secret under the Department of the Interior and Homeland Security protocols. Civilians are not permitted on the premises, regardless of their prior involvement." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ground beneath my feet felt insubstantial. "Involvement?" I sputtered, stepping forward. "I am not involved. I am his guardian. I am his family. You said I needed to come. You said my presence was essential for his rehabilitation." "I said what was necessary to ensure your cooperation and to keep the asset calm during the extraction process," she replied, her tone shifting to one of bored pragmatism. "And frankly, your role is finished. You have been a caretaker, and an effective one. But you are not a biologist. You are not a virologist. And you were certainly not cleared for this level of operation." Before I could process the betrayal, before I could scream or lunge or demand answers, two of the tactical officers who had been standing by the SUVs stepped onto the porch behind me, flanking me. I had not even heard them move. One of them, a giant of a man with a face obscured by a balaclava, handed me a clipboard with a thick stack of papers clamped to it. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the handle of my bag. "That is a non-disclosure agreement, coupled with a federal seizure order," Eris explained, tapping the screen of her tablet. "It states that you will never speak of what happened here. You will never mention the asset, the organization, or the extraction. It also retroactively classifies your property as a permanent biological hazard zone." "You cannot do that," I whispered, the horror rising in my throat like bile. "Silas is not going to a sanctuary, is he?" Dr. Eris sighed, looking at her watch as if I were a meeting that was running overtime. "There is no sanctuary, Elias. I thought a man of your resourcefulness would understand the reality of the situation. These creatures are vectors for pathogens we do not understand. They are invasive megafauna that do not belong in the modern ecosystem. The virus he is carrying? It is a novel hantavirus strain that binds specifically to the relic hominid genome. It is deadly to his kind and disastrous to livestock." "Then why are you not wearing a mask?" I demanded, gesturing to her exposed face. "Why are not you in a suit?" "Because the virus is species-specific," she said coldly. "It cannot replicate in human cells. It will not kill you, Elias. But that is the tragedy of your situation. You are now a permanent vector, a carrier. You are walking biological fallout. You can never leave this property again. If you walk into a town, if you approach a cattle ranch or a population center, you become Typhoid Mary. Our satellites will pick up your thermal signature, and a drone will neutralize the containment breach before you reach the pavement. You are not just signing an NDA, you are signing your own quarantine order." My blood ran cold, freezing in my veins. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were not doctors. They were a cleanup crew, and I was part of the waste. "You lied," I said, my voice rising to a shout. "You lied to me. You're going to kill him." "He is a biological liability," she said over her shoulder as she turned back toward the truck. "And the risk of transport is too high. If he expires in transit, the viral load becomes unstable. We have to neutralize the threat at the source." "No!" I screamed, dropping the duffel bag. "No! He is sentient! He is a person!" I lunged for the door, my mind flashing to the rifle I had stupidly left leaning against the wall in the mudroom. But I never made it. The officer on my right moved with a speed that defied his size. He grabbed my arm and slammed me against a rough log wall of the cabin. pinning me there with an arm across my throat. My head cracked against the wood, stars exploding in my vision. But I kept screaming. "Silas! Silas, wake up! They're killing you! Wake up!" "Restrain him," Eris ordered calmly, not even looking back. "But do not damage him. We need him to sign the papers." Through the window of the truck, the back of which was still open, I saw the nightmare unfold. A man in a full hazmat suit was standing over the stretcher. He was not holding a stethoscope or an IV bag. He was holding a device that looked like a heavy, industrial piston, a pneumatic bolt gun, the kind used in slaughterhouses to dispatch cattle instantly. Silas was still sedated, his chest rising and falling in that slow, trusting rhythm. He did not know. He did not know that the people I had called, the people I had promised would save him, were his executioners. He was dreaming of the mountains, or of the music videos we watched, or of the safety I had sworn to provide. "Do not do it," I begged, tears streaming down my face, my voice breaking into a ragged sob. "Please, I'll pay you. I'll do anything. Just let him go. Just leave us alone." Dr. Eris ignored me. She nodded to the man in the truck. I watched, helpless, pinned against the wood of my own home by a man who followed orders without question. As the figure in the hazmat suit placed the muzzle of the device against Silas's forehead, right between those beautiful amber eyes. There was no dramatic speech. There was no hesitation. There was just a sharp, compressed thump, a sound like a heavy book being dropped flat on a table. Silas did not flinch. He did not cry out. His massive body simply jerked once, a violent galvanic spasm, and then went still. His head lolled to the side, his tongue sliding out of his mouth. The light, whatever spark of soul had lived in that magnificent, ancient frame, was extinguished in a fraction of a second. I stopped screaming. The air left my lungs and did not come back. I hung limp in the officer's grip, staring at the body of my brother, my friend, the only thing that had given my life meaning for 23 years. He was gone, just like that. Meat. He was just meat now. "Asset neutralized," the man in the truck called out. "Preparing for incineration." "Proceed," Eris said. "Use the chemical accelerant. We need total sterilization within 60 minutes. They did not even have the decency to take his body away. They brought out a portable unit from the third SUV, a terrifyingly efficient machine that looked like a large industrial kiln on wheels. They wheeled Silas's body, my Silas, who loved classical music and wept at loneliness, off the truck and shoved him into the chamber. They treated him like medical waste, like trash. The roar of the incinerator was a sound I will hear until the day I die. It was a jet engine roar, a blast of propane and chemical fire designed to reduce bone and tissue to sterile ash in minutes. The smell hit me a moment later, and I gagged, retching dryly onto the porch floor. It did not smell like wood smoke. It smelled of burning hair, of copper, of the musk that had filled my barn for decades. It was the smell of my failure. Dr. Eris walked back to the porch while the machine did its work. She stood over me, looking down with that same cold, clinical detachment. The officer released me, letting me slide down the wall to the floor, where I sat huddled, shaking violently. "Sign the papers, Mr. Thorne," she said, placing the clipboard on my lap and holding out a pen. "If you sign, we leave you your pension. We leave you your land. We leave you with the illusion of freedom. If you do not sign, or if you try to leave the containment zone of this valley, we will treat you exactly as we treated the asset. You are a biological hazard now, Elias. Remember that." I looked at the pen. I looked at the black smoke rising from the incinerator stack, drifting up into the blue Montana sky, merging with the haze from the wildfires. It did not matter anymore. Nothing mattered. Silas was ash. The truth was ash. And I was a prisoner in the only place on earth I had ever felt free. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold a pen. I signed my name, Elias Thorne, on the dotted lines. I signed away my right to speak. I signed away my history. I signed away the existence of the most beautiful soul I had ever known. "Wise choice," Eris said. He took the clipboard, then signaled to her team. "Pack it up. We are done here." They moved with the same terrifying speed. The medical equipment was stowed. The incinerator, now cooling, was loaded back into the SUV. One of the men came out of the house carrying my laptop and my stack of leather-bound journals. 23 years of memories. Stolen. He threw them into the back of the truck like kindling. Within 20 minutes, they were ready to move. The engines roared to life. Dr. Eris climbed into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. She did not look back at me. She did not offer a platitude or a warning. I was already a ghost to her, a loose end that had been tied off and quarantined. The convoy rolled out, the tires crunching over the gravel, kicking up dust. They drove out the gate I had opened, down the road I had watched, and disappeared around the bend in the trees. I sat on the porch for a long time. The sun moved across the sky. The smoke from the incinerator dissipated, carried away by the wind. The dust settled. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to a stranger, and walked down the stairs to the driveway. There was a scorch mark on the gravel, a blackened circle where the machine had stood, and in the center of it, swirling in small eddies from the breeze, was a pile of gray, gritty ash. I fell to my knees in the dirt. I reached out and scooped up a handful of the ash. It was still warm. It coated my skin, gray and soft. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the dust in my hands. "I'm so sorry, Silas. I'm sorry." I looked up at the mountains, at the snow-capped peaks that had watched us for so long. The perimeter alarm was silent. The barn was empty. The journals were gone. The only proof that he had ever existed was the gray stain on my hands and the hole in my chest that felt wide enough to swallow the world. And then the silence returned. But it was not the peaceful silence of the morning, the silence of solitude and contentment. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the silence of a tomb, the silence of a world that had been given a miracle and had chosen to burn it. I opened my hand, and the wind caught the ash, lifting it up, carrying Silas back toward the ravine, back toward the wild, leaving me alone in the crushing, absolute quiet of the Cabinet Mountains.